Think groceries are expensive today? Medieval peasants had it tougher, surviving only on what they grew or foraged. These 15 simple meals weren't fancy, but they kept families alive through plagues, famines, and backbreaking labor, starting with the very first on the list. Pottage. Pottage was the staple of medieval peasants, a thick stew that never really ended. Made from cheap grains like barley or oats, it simmered for days as families tossed in whatever they had: turnips, onions, cabbage, or if lucky, peas and carrots. Herbs added flavor, and on rare occasions a scrap of pork gave extra richness. Peasants ate 2 to 3 pints a day, keeping the pot alive through famine and winters. It wasn't fancy, but this forever stew was the fuel that kept medieval life going. Bread. For peasants, bread was life, dense, dark, and nothing like today's loaves. Made from rye or barley, it was often stretched with peas, beans, acorns, or even bark. A man might eat 2 to 3 pounds daily, fueling long hours in the fields. Baked weekly in communal ovens, loaves grew stale fast and had to be dipped in pottage or ale. Worse, rye sometimes carried ergot fungus, causing sickness or hallucinations. Still, bread was sacred and often the only food that kept families alive in famine. Gruel. Gruel was survival food, little more than grain scraps boiled in lots of water. Thin, bland, and barely filling, it appeared when bread ran out and pottage couldn't be made. Monks often ate it during fasts, sometimes sweetened with honey or fruit, but peasants rarely had such luxuries. The sick, elderly, and even children were fed gruel, though it offered almost no real nutrition. Turnips. In medieval times, turnips were a survival staple. Hardy and fast-growing, they thrived in poor soil, needed little care, and produced huge yields. One seed could provide up to 15 pounds of food. Peasants boiled them into simple stews, stored them in cellars or straw-lined pits for months, and used every part: roots, leaves, even flowers. A family might need 200 pounds just to last the winter. Cabbage and onions. Cabbage and onions were peasant staples, adding flavor to otherwise plain meals. Cabbage was especially valuable. Huge heads could weigh up to 15 pounds and outer leaves could be picked while the plant kept growing. Fresh heads stored well, and soured cabbage, or early sauerkraut, lasted all winter in pits. Onions grew easily in poor soil, stored for months, and even helped repel pests when planted near other crops. Together, they made soups, stews, and side dishes heartier, and sometimes even served as payment for debts. Peas and beans. For protein, peas and beans were the peasant's lifeline. Dried peas held about 25% protein, making them vital when meat was scarce. A small patch could yield 60 pounds, enough to help a family through winter. They were easy to grow, even in poor soil, and stored for years when dried. Most often they were soaked, boiled, and mashed into a thick paste, sometimes flavored with salt or herbs. Monks also relied on them, especially during meatless days, with abbeys storing thousands of pounds each year. Offal and scraps. While nobles feasted on prime cuts, peasants made do with the leftovers: organs, heads, feet, and scraps. Nothing went to waste. Pig heads were boiled for meat, ears fried crisp, and even brains scrambled like eggs. Cow stomachs held grain and organ mixtures, sheep lungs were fried with onions, and blood became pudding when mixed with grain. Small game, and in desperate times, even badgers or rats, also flavored stews. Offal spoiled quickly, so it was cooked, salted, or smoked the same day, often turning butchering into a communal feast. For peasants, the rule was simple: if it wasn't deadly, it was dinner. Salted herring. For coastal peasants, salted herring was the go-to fast food of the Middle Ages. Caught in massive numbers and packed in barrels of salt, it traveled far inland and lasted for months without spoiling. Herring solved 3 problems. It replaced meat during church fasts, provided cheap protein year-round, and required no cooking. Just eat with bread and keep working. Wealthier peasants sometimes bought smoked red herring, which kept even longer. Ale, small beer. Water was risky to drink, so peasants relied on weak ale, about 1 to 3% alcohol, as their daily beverage. Even children drank it since it was safer than water and more like flavored liquid bread than strong beer. Workers often consumed up to a gallon a day with extra during harvest. Brewing was mostly women's work, done at home in small batches that spoiled within a week. Ale and bread went hand in hand, sharing grain and yeast, and were often made together. Cider and mead. On special occasions, peasants enjoyed cider or mead, rare sweet drinks that doubled as food storage solutions. Apple trees were easy to grow, lasting for decades and thriving even on poor land. Families pressed apples, let the juice ferment naturally, and produced cider that kept for months. Weak versions were daily drinks, while stronger ones, 4 to 8% alcohol, were saved for weddings and harvest feasts. Mead, made from honey and water, was Europe's oldest alcohol but costly for peasants since honey was scarce. Most only tasted it a few times a year, though some kept beehives for small batches. Both cider and mead preserved natural sugars without refrigeration and provided quick calories during shortages, making them more than just festive treats. Honey and wild berries, sweet treats. For peasants, true sweetness came from honey and wild berries, luxuries compared to their plain daily meals. Honey was prized not only as food but also as medicine, hair gel, and even for wound care. Collecting it was risky, with peasants climbing trees or smoking hives to harvest combs, though some kept simple beehives that could yield 15 to 20 pounds a year. So valuable was honey that records show it listed in wills or punished as harshly as livestock theft if stolen. Wild berries, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries were seasonal treasures gathered by families and children. Without sugar, they couldn't be stored, making them fleeting treats. When honey and berries came together, it was a rare delight, sometimes served at feasts for nobles. For most peasants, tasting honey-sweetened berries was a once-in-a-lifetime luxury. Nuts, acorns, and chestnuts. Forests served as backup pantries for peasants. Chestnuts, known as the bread tree, were sweet, filling, and could yield 200 pounds from a single tree, roasted, boiled, or ground into flour to last through winter. Acorns, though bitter, were leached of tannins and turned into rough famine bread. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, records even mention fights over nut-gathering rights, showing how vital they were for survival. Wild plants and forage foods. When crops failed, peasants turned to the wild for food. Spring meant nettles, dandelions, and sorrel. Summer brought mushrooms, garlic, and chickweed, though mushroom picking was risky. In hard times, wild leeks and ramps were lifesavers. Autumn added nuts, berries, and crab apples rich in vitamins. Women often led this foraging and were even paid to teach it. Normally, wild foods made up 5 to 10% of the diet, but in famine years they could reach 30%. Disputes over forest rights in court records show just how vital foraging was to survival. Ash cakes. In times of famine, peasants turned to ash cakes, a last resort bread made with whatever meal was available. The process was simple. Mix grain, or substitutes like acorns, bark, or roots, with water, form a patty, and bake it directly in hot ashes. No oven, no tools, just fire and desperation. Though rarely eaten in normal years, ash cakes became essential during crises like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when some were even made from dust swept off granary floors. They cooked quickly, unlike traditional bread, making them practical for workers or the starving. Gritty, smoky, and bitter, they were far from tasty, but they provided vital calories that helped many survive when Europe faced its deadliest food shortages. Meals, leftover mixes. For peasants, dinner was usually a pot of scraps, vegetables, peas, mushrooms, cabbage, or preserved foods, boiled into a filling stew. Meals were improvised, sometimes left to simmer all day, or eaten cold with bread when time was short. Since most peasants ate only once or twice daily, this single hearty mix had to sustain them. Over time, dishes like French ratatouille and Italian ribollita grew out of these humble leftovers, with holidays bringing rare extras like salt, spices, or fresh spring greens to turn simple food into a small feast. And that's how medieval peasants turned scraps into survival, and sometimes even into timeless dishes. If you enjoyed this glimpse into their kitchen, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you in the next one.